Welcome, dear friends, to tonight's tale, Death Among the Christmas Decorations, a Miss Marple Mystery. On this frosty Christmas Eve in St. Mary Mead, snow crowns the rooftops and golden light glows from cottage windows. The grand hall of St. Mary Mead shimmered with festive cheer as villagers hung tinsel, candles, and evergreen wreaths. Laughter echoed, warm against the winter chill, until a sudden crash silenced the room. A prized glass ornament lay shattered, and from within its hollow center slipped a folded scrap of paper. Curious hands unfolded it, and the words written there froze the merriment at once. Beware the 12th night. Whispers stirred uneasily, glances darted. Miss Marple, quietly tying a sprig of mistletoe, observed with calm precision. Was it mischief meant to amuse, or a warning no one should ignore? Chapter 1. A Village in Garlanded Cheer. The morning of Christmas Eve dawned clear and bright, though the frost clung stubbornly to every hedge and garden gate in St. Mary Mead. Children's boots crunched across the village green as they carried sprigs of holly and ivy, destined for the great hall that would host the evening fete. The place was already buzzing when Miss Marple arrived, her small figure wrapped in a sensible coat and a scarf knitted by her own hands. The villagers greeted her warmly, for she was as much a part of the season as the carols and the puddings. Inside, the vicar's wife directed proceedings with a brisk but cheerful efficiency. Mrs. Clement was a tall, angular woman whose good intentions sometimes made her seem sterner than she meant. She clapped her hands to gather attention and urged the volunteers to fasten the last garland securely. "We mustn't have anything tumbling down on our guests tonight," she insisted, though her eyes softened when she saw the children giggling as they tangled themselves in ribbons. Hovering nearby was a maid borrowed from the vicarage to help polish the silver and arrange the platters. Her hands were deft, but her eyes kept darting toward the windows, as though she half expected something, or someone, to appear out in the snowy churchyard beyond. Miss Marple noticed the way the girl's shoulders tensed whenever a door creaked or a draft swept in. She was young, perhaps too new to village life to be comfortable with its hidden undercurrents. And then, like a brisk wind scattering calm, the colonel strode in. Colonel Hartwell was retired, though he rarely let anyone forget his years of service. He wore his military bearing as proudly as his mustache, and his booming voice carried across the rafters. "I say, Mrs. Clement, the flags are all in the wrong order. Must have Union Jack in the center, otherwise it looks a muddle." The colonel's opinions were as unavoidable as the cold weather, and though most villagers smiled politely, some exchanged weary glances behind his back. Miss Marple, arranging a cluster of paper lanterns, quietly observed the interplay of personalities. She had long believed that a fete was not unlike a stage play. Every character revealed more in these small moments of preparation than they might in a month of polite conversation. She saw Mrs. Bartlett, the grocer's wife, leaning in conspiratorially to whisper into Mrs. Price's ear, their laughter subdued but sharp. Gossip was the currency of the village, and it flowed most freely when hands were busy with ribbons and pins. "Did you hear," murmured Mrs. Bartlett, her eyes flicking toward the colonel, "that he quarreled with his solicitor again last week? Something about money tied up in a trust." Mrs. Price tittered, shaking her head. "Oh, with him it's always money or medals. Still, one never knows what's true and what's bluster." Miss Marple's gaze, sharp though kindly, took in every detail: the maid's unease, the colonel's bluster, the wives' gossip. Each seemed harmless on its own, yet together they painted a pattern, subtle but telling. In her experience, small frictions often hinted at larger truths waiting quietly beneath the surface. The scent of pine filled the air as more greenery was fastened to the beams. The hall was nearly transformed now, every corner glowing with festive promise. And yet, if one looked closely, there was more than cheer woven into the garlands. There were rivalries, worries, secrets tucked into every glance and word. Miss Marple smiled gently to herself, adjusting a lantern. For in every village gathering, secrets are as plentiful as decorations. When the bustle of wreath hanging and lantern lighting quieted for a moment, Miss Marple stepped aside to untangle a length of ribbon. The maid was nearby, polishing candlesticks until they gleamed like mirrors. Her hands worked swiftly, but her expression remained troubled, the shadow of unease never quite lifting from her face. Miss Marple, with her gentle manner, was never one to startle the timid. She lowered her voice kindly. "You're very thorough, my dear. Mr. Clement will be pleased to see everything shining so well." The girl flushed at the praise, but did not look up. "Thank you, ma'am. I do try." She hesitated, glanced at the door, then bent closer as if drawn by an invisible weight. "Though, to tell the truth, I hardly slept last night. The noises outside kept me awake." Miss Marple's knitting bag rested at her side, and she smoothed the yarn thoughtfully. "Noises?" she prompted, her tone no more urgent than if she had asked about the weather. The maid nodded. "From the churchyard. Not the kind of sound you'd expect. Heavy steps, slow, and then a scraping like wood against stone. I thought perhaps it was the wind, but the air was still. It sounded deliberate." Her whisper faded into the cheerful hum of others stringing bells overhead. A burst of laughter from the colonel covered the hush between them, giving her courage to continue. And then she lowered her voice further, a sharp crack, as though something broke. Miss Marple's eyes, calm and unblinking, rested kindly on the girl's pale face. "You didn't look out?" "Oh, no, ma'am. I pulled the blanket over my head and prayed it would pass. It's not my place to go peering about." The girl shook her head quickly, twisting the cloth in her hands. "But I know what I heard. It wasn't natural." The old lady considered this with a mild expression of one pondering knitting stitches. Around them, decorations glittered and the aroma of cloves and cinnamon drifted through the air. "Well," she said gently, "our churchyard has been quiet for centuries, and most likely it will remain so. Still, it is always worth noting what unsettles the heart." The maid glanced toward the frosted windows, where the white world beyond pressed close against the glass. "Sometimes I feel eyes upon me when I pass that way at dusk," she murmured, "as though someone stands just out of sight." Before Miss Marple could reply, Mrs. Bartlett's voice rang out, calling for more holly. The maid straightened hastily, shoulders stiff, and busied herself once more with the candlesticks. To any casual observer, she was simply another pair of hands preparing the hall, but Miss Marple had marked the tremor in her voice, the earnest fear that lingered even as she smiled and nodded dutifully. The laughter resumed. Music was tested on the piano, and the hall filled once more with light chatter and festive cheer. Yet, in the quiet corners of Miss Marple's mind, the girl's words echoed. Steps in the churchyard, a scraping like wood, a sharp crack in the still night. What could possibly stir in the quiet of a snowy churchyard? Chapter 2. The Fate Begins. Evening settled gently upon St. Mary Mead, the last shades of dusk slipping away as the village hall blazed with warmth and color. From the outside, its windows glowed like golden lanterns, casting cheerful squares of light onto the snowy ground. The sound of music floated out, mingling with the jingle of sleigh bells as neighbors arrived wrapped in scarves and heavy coats, cheeks flushed from the cold. Inside, the air was fragrant with mulled wine and spice, a comforting perfume that wrapped itself around every guest as they stepped through the doorway. Tables draped in white linen offered mince pies, sugared biscuits, and bowls of roasted chestnuts, while at the far end of the hall a small band tuned fiddles and tested notes on the piano. Laughter mingled with the faint rustle of skirts and the tapping of polished shoes across the wooden floor. Mrs. Clement, proud of her efforts, moved from group to group with a welcoming smile. She ensured every guest had a steaming cup in hand and steered conversations toward cheerful subjects. Yet Miss Marple, seated near the fire with her knitting bag tucked discreetly beside her chair, noticed how often her eyes flickered toward the anxious maid, now stationed at the refreshment table. The girl poured wine and offered slices of fruitcake with a smile, but the tension in her shoulders had not eased since morning. The colonel stood near the band, booming about military marches and insisting the evening would be improved if they played a proper regimental tune. Most nodded politely, though Mrs. Price and Mrs. Bartlett exchanged knowing looks that required no words. Their gossip resumed in hushed tones the moment he turned his back. "I heard," whispered Mrs. Bartlett, her voice barely carrying above the music, "that Mrs. Hardwick has received another letter from her nephew. He won't be home for Christmas, after all." Mrs. Price clucked sympathetically. "Poor woman. But mark my words, she knows more about that boy's affairs than she lets on." Their words fluttered away like moths, leaving only the glint of speculation in their eyes. The hall sparkled with tinsel and ribbons, and a scent of evergreen boughs lent a fresh brightness to the atmosphere. Children darted about, playing hide-and-seek among the chairs until a stern glance from Mrs. Clement herded them toward the piano for carols. The first chords rang out, sweet and slightly uncertain, before the voices of villagers rose together in song. Through it all, Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly, her gaze drifting from face to face. She observed the flush on Mrs. Hardwick's cheeks when her name was mentioned, the way the colonel's boastful stance faltered for a moment when a solicitor entered late, brushing snow from his shoulders. These were not the details most guests noticed. Yet to her, they painted a richer picture than the decorations ever could. The merriment seemed unbroken. Laughter, chatter, the clink of glasses. Still, beneath it lay something quieter, a hum of unease, a flicker of secrets kept close. Perhaps it was only the nature of a village fete, where old quarrels brushed shoulders with holiday cheer. Or perhaps it was something more. But even in laughter, eyes watch, and ears listen too closely. The carols had scarcely ended when a sharp voice cut through the hum of conversation. Mrs. Larkin, round-faced and quick to temper, stood near the doorway with her hands planted firmly on her hips. Opposite her, Mr. Hargreaves, the village carpenter, looked equally indignant. Though his voice was lower, his words clipped like nails struck too hard. "It was my wreath, I tell you," Mrs. Larkin declared, her cheeks flushed. "Handmade, with holly from my own hedge. And now it's gone, spirited away, no doubt by someone who thought they'd get the better of me." Mr. Hargreaves bristled. "Nonsense. I've enough of my own to bother with. What use have I for your prickly hedge trimmings? If you ask me, it was never put in place properly. Blew away in the wind, most likely." Several villagers turned to watch, their conversations faltering. There was always some entertainment in a quarrel, and the scent of rivalry was as familiar to St. Mary Mead as the smoke from its chimneys. Mrs. Bartlett, perched nearby, whispered eagerly to Mrs. Price, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction at fresh gossip unfolding before her. Miss Marple, seated by the fire, lifted her head just slightly, her eyes twinkling with quiet attention. She had witnessed enough village disputes to know they often revealed more than they intended. Mrs. Larkin's voice rose again. Wind, indeed. There wasn't a gust strong enough to carry off a wreath as stout as mine. Someone took it, Someone right here in this hall, bold as brass. And I shall have it back before the evening's out." The colonel harumphed loudly, as though his authority might settle the matter. Now, no need to ruffle feathers over a trifling decoration. We're here for merriment, not accusations." But his words lacked conviction, and he seemed more eager to return to his mulled wine than mediate between neighbors. The anxious maid at the refreshment table dropped her gaze quickly, as though fearful the quarrel might turn her way. She poured another cup of wine, hands trembling just enough for Miss Marple to notice. Meanwhile, Mr. Hargreaves crossed his arms. "If you've lost your wreath, perhaps you should look closer to home. Maybe it was borrowed to patch up some other display. Mistakes happen, Mrs. Larkin. No need to make a scene." But Mrs. Larkin's glare suggested the matter was far from over. The quarrel subsided into mutterings, each party bristling, their indignation feeding the whispers that spread through the crowd. The laughter resumed, but the mood had shifted just slightly. The glitter of decorations no longer seemed to shine quite as brightly. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly once more. She smiled at a child who paused near her chair, but her mind lingered on the quarrel. A missing wreath might be nothing more than a trivial squabble, the kind of thing villagers delighted in stretching beyond reason. Yet sometimes, she knew, small quarrels pointed toward larger discontents. A borrowed item, a slighted pride, a rumor turned sour. These were the threads from which darker patterns could be woven. She sipped her tea, letting the warmth settle her thoughts, while around her the fete carried on with apparent cheer. The music played, the colonel boasted again, and Mrs. Clement tried valiantly to smooth over ruffled tempers. But Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the corners of the hall, where whispers clung and glances sharpened. And from small quarrels, great crimes may grow. Chapter 3. A Shadow in the Snow. The fate wound down with gentle reluctance, as laughter gave way to yawns, and the final cups of mulled wine were drained. Coats were fetched from pegs, scarves wrapped tightly, and the guests spilled out into the frosty night. The snow had begun again, fine flakes drifting steadily from the black sky, settling on caps and shoulders. Miss Marple, while wrapped against the cold, offered polite good nights and set off at her own steady pace toward home. The village green lay hushed, the lanterns dim now that most folk had retired. Only the crunch of her sensible boots disturbed the silence. She found comfort in the quiet. The way snow softened every sound and made the familiar cottages appear dreamlike beneath their sugared rooftops. Yet as she passed the churchyard gate, something caught her eye, a flicker of movement against the white. There, half concealed among the gravestones, a figure slipped through the shadows. It was no illusion. The shape was distinct, purposeful. A cloak or heavy coat swayed with each step. Miss Marple paused, drawing a little nearer to the gate, her breath rising in pale clouds. For a moment, the figure halted, as though sensing her gaze. The air between them hung taut, silent but expectant. Then, just as suddenly, it moved on, vanishing behind the yews that bordered the far wall of the churchyard. Miss Marple lingered, peering into the drifting snow. Who could be abroad at such an hour? And for what purpose? The fate had left no shortage of villagers still awake, but their paths should have taken them homeward, not here among the graves. She considered the possibility of a stranger. It was not impossible, though St. Mary Mead was rarely visited by those without reason. Still, her mind ticked through names. The colonel, pompous but proud. The anxious maid, unlikely to wander alone. Mr. Hargreaves, perhaps restless after his quarrel with Mrs. Larkin. Each was conceivable, yet none quite fitted the shape she had glimpsed. The snow muffled all sound, yet faintly, she thought she heard the crunch of boots retreating beyond the wall. Her sharp eyes noted the freshness of footprints near the gate, too large to be a child's, too deliberate to be an accident. She bent slightly, examining them with the calm interest she gave to any pattern. Each step pressed firm into the powder, the stride steady. Whoever it was had not hurried, but neither had they wished to linger. Pulling her scarf tighter, Miss Marple resumed her walk. To any passerby, she would seem merely an elderly lady heading home from a long evening, her pace slow but untroubled. Yet within, her thoughts turned over the matter carefully. She did not dwell on superstition or fancy. She trusted what her eyes told her, and they had seen a figure where none should be. By the time she reached her cottage, snow coated her hat and shoulders. She brushed it off gently before stepping inside, the fire still glowing faintly in the hearth. Setting down her gloves, she allowed herself a final glance through the frosted window toward the churchyard. All was still now. The gravestones hunched beneath white blankets, the gate closed as though untouched. And yet, she could not quite dismiss the image of that moving shadow. In the stillness of falling snow, even footsteps tell tales. The morning after the fete dawned pale and brittle, the frost glazing every window pane and stiffening the hedgerows. Miss Marple, already up and about with her knitting basket by her side, was not surprised to hear a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, the anxious maid, young Clara, cheeks reddened from the cold, stood shifting from foot to foot, her gloved hands twisting together. "Come in, child," Miss Marple said warmly, ushering her toward the comfort of the fire. Clara obeyed, though her eyes darted about as though she feared even the walls might listen. She perched on the edge of the chair, clasping her hands tightly in her lap. "I didn't know who else to tell," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I thought, you see more than others, ma'am. You always do." Miss Marple smiled gently, settling herself opposite. "Then perhaps you had better tell me what troubles you. A worry unspoken tends to grow larger than it truly is." Clara drew a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the flames. "It was yesterday evening, just before the hall was filled. I had gone back to fetch another box of candles. Mrs. Hargreaves sent me. When I came in again, the place was quiet, near empty, and there, by the far wall, I saw someone bent over the garlands." Miss Marple listened intently, her needles still in her lap. "Someone? You did not see their face?" Clara shook her head quickly. "No, only the shape of them. Tall, wrapped up in a dark coat. I thought at first it was Mr. Larkin fussing with the wreaths, but the way they moved wasn't like him. More careful, more deliberate." She swallowed, her fingers twisting tighter. "And then I noticed the ribbon on one of the wreaths was being pulled loose as though something was tucked behind it. I heard the faintest sound, like paper crackling, and then," she broke off, glancing nervously at Miss Marple. "When they saw me, they straightened at once and slipped off through the side door. I only caught the swish of the coat, nothing more." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her eyes sharpened. "You are certain they were not merely adjusting the decorations?" Clara bit her lip. "That's just it, ma'am. It didn't feel like adjusting. It felt like hiding something, or placing it where it oughtn't be. I daren't say why, but it set my heart racing. I could hardly carry the box after." The fire crackled softly, filling the pause. Miss Marple considered the account with her usual quiet patience. Such details, ribbons, garlands, wreaths, seemed innocent enough, yet Clara's fear lent them weight. "You did right to tell me," she said at last. "Very right indeed. We mustn't leap to dreadful conclusions, of course, but we also must not ignore what the eye has plainly seen." Clara exhaled, as though relieved by the reassurance, yet her brow remained furrowed. "You don't think it was just foolish nerves?" Miss Marple gave a small smile. Nerves, my dear, are often wiser than reason. They notice what the mind is inclined to dismiss. A ribbon might be only a ribbon, or it may be chosen for its very concealment. One must never underestimate the ingenuity of those who wish to go unseen. Clara shivered, drawing her shawl tighter. It felt wrong, ma'am. Wrong in a way I can't explain. As though something dreadful might come of it. Miss Marple reached across and patted her hand kindly. Then we shall keep our eyes open, you and I. Could a ribbon hide a trap? Could holly conceal harm? Such notions may sound fanciful over tea and biscuits, but in my experience, the smallest ornament can carry the heaviest secret. Clara nodded, comforted by the older woman's calm. The firelight glowed on both their faces, warming the chill that had crept into the maid's heart. Yet as she took her leave, Miss Marple's gaze lingered thoughtfully on the hearth. Decorations, ribbons, wreaths, so ordinary, yet perhaps not so innocent after all. Chapter 4. The Fatal Midnight. The village hall glowed with all the warmth and merriment that Christmas Eve could provide. The air was fragrant with mulled wine, pine branches, and the faint sweetness of sugared biscuits. Lanterns shone from every rafter, and garlands of evergreen looped above the crowd. Music drifted from the piano where Mrs. Winthrop, cheeks flushed with festive spirit, played another round of carols. Voices rose together, filling the rafters with cheer. Miss Marple, seated at a quiet table near the edge of the hall, observed with her customary calm. She watched the colonel boasting loudly of his wartime exploits, his hand raised high with his glass of claret. The vicar's wife fussed over the placement of mince pies, while two children dashed about, nearly tripping over the hem of Mrs. Hargreaves' gown. All appeared as it should, a village rejoicing, bound by tradition and companionship. Yet beneath the merriment, Miss Marple noted small shadows. The anxious maid Clara lingered near the door, her gaze flitting nervously to the decorations. The quarrel over the wreath earlier that evening had not wholly faded. Two neighbors still avoided each other, their smiles a little too stiff. And the colonel himself, though jovial in manner, bore a ruddy flush that did not seem entirely from drink. The evening pressed on. Glasses were refilled, laughter rang louder, and at last the vicar announced the striking of midnight. Bells rang out, their peals echoing beyond the hall into the snow-bound streets. Guests raised their glasses high, toasting to Christmas, to good health, to the year ahead. Candles flickered warmly, and for one shining moment, joy seemed untarnished. Then it happened. A scream, sharp and piercing, tore through the music. It came from the far end of the hall, where the great Christmas tree rose in splendid height, hung with baubles and ribbons. The piano fell silent mid-note. Glasses halted in mid-air. Every head turned, and silence crashed down, broken only by that dreadful cry. People surged forward in a rush of confusion. What is it? Who screamed? Good heavens, what's happened? The voices overlapped, edged with fear. Miss Marple rose, her knitting forgotten in its basket. She moved with calm precision, weaving through the press of anxious villagers. Her keen eyes followed the path of pointing fingers, all directed toward the base of the tree. There, amid the scattered holly and tumbled garlands, lay the colonel. He was sprawled awkwardly on the floor, his glass shattered beside him. Around his neck, entangled like some grotesque necklace, was a broken length of evergreen garland. The needles bent and snapped, dangling as though torn in haste. His ruddy complexion had drained to a ghastly pallor. For a long moment, the hall was silent save for the ragged breaths of those nearest. Then the murmurs began. He's fainted. No, he's dead. The colonel. Oh heavens, the colonel. The word spread like wildfire. each whisper fueling panic. The vicar hurried forward, kneeling beside the fallen man. His trembling fingers searched for a pulse, but the expression that crossed his face told the story before he spoke. He looked up, pale and shaken. He is gone. A collective gasp swept through the hall. Women clutched one another. Men muttered in disbelief. Christmas cheer had dissolved in an instant, leaving behind fear, confusion, and a heavy weight of death. Miss Marple did not cry out, nor did she collapse as some of the ladies did. Instead, she stood very still, her eyes narrowing slightly as they traced the scene. The toppled decorations, the broken garland, the position of the colonel's body, each detail etched itself into her mind. Someone whispered, among laughter and carols, "Death has joined the celebration." The words struck like a chill draft through the hall, silencing further noise. The colonel, pompous and hardy only minutes before, now lay lifeless at the very heart of their joy. And as Miss Marple looked on, she could not help but think that this was no accident, no simple collapse brought on by excessive wine. No, there was something deliberate here, something hidden amid the holly and tinsel. And so, as midnight candles guttered low and fear coiled itself tightly around the hall, the fate that had begun in cheer turned solemn. The snow outside pressed heavily against the windows, sealing the villagers in with their dread. Christmas had come to St. Mary Mead, but so, it seemed, had murder. The hall, once filled with song, now sat in uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional sob or whispered speculation. The colonel's body had been carefully covered with a cloak, though its presence loomed heavy over every villager present. Outside, the crunch of boots on frozen ground heralded the arrival of Inspector Graves, a stout man with a lined face and a no-nonsense air. Behind him came two constables, stamping snow from their boots as they entered. "Clear some space, please clear some space," Graves commanded, his voice echoing against the timbered ceiling. The crowd shifted back reluctantly, each person craning to see more even as they recoiled in fear. Miss Marple, quietly watching from a modest chair near the fire, noted how swiftly the atmosphere had changed. Every twinkle of tinsel now seemed to hide a secret. Every smiling face just an hour before now shadowed with doubt. People whispered not just about what had happened, but about each other. The inspector asked brisk questions, his pen scratching against his notebook. Who found him? What was the colonel doing before the fall? Did anyone notice anything unusual in the minutes leading up to it? Mrs. Hargreaves, still pale, spoke of hearing the colonel laugh loudly just before midnight. Mr. Larkin muttered that the colonel had been drinking more heavily than was wise. Someone else recalled a sharp exchange earlier in the evening between the colonel and the vicar's wife about funds for the church roof. Another voice, lower and sharper, hinted at a quarrel the colonel had had last week with a neighbor over a boundary hedge. The possibilities multiplied with alarming speed. Money disputes, jealous rivalries, wounded pride. All the small frictions of village life now appeared tinged with menace. Miss Marple listened, her head slightly bent as though absorbed in her knitting, though her eyes never missed a detail. She noticed the anxious maid Clara hovering near the door, twisting her apron in her hands, her eyes fixed on the floorboards as though afraid to meet anyone's gaze. She saw Mrs. Winthrop clutching her pearls too tightly, her lips pressed thin as though suppressing words best left unsaid. And she observed the vicar's wife, normally serene, fidgeting with her handkerchief in a manner quite unlike her usual composure. Inspector Graves attempted order, yet suspicion seemed to spread quicker than his questions could contain. "He was in debt, I heard," whispered one villager. "No, it was jealousy "Didn't you see the way Mrs. Carter looked at him during the carols?" said another. "Mark my words, it's about the land sale," insisted a third. The hall, decorated in holly and candlelight, now felt more like a stage upon which every soul present had a potential part to play in the grim drama. The inspector's stern voice carried, but it was the undercurrent of gossip that truly filled the air. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly, her eyes calm and steady amid the rising tide of confusion. She knew better than most how small quarrels and petty grievances could mask deeper motives. The colonel's manner had not made him beloved. He was respected, perhaps feared, but kindness had never been his strength. That alone ensured a long list of possible grudges. She did not speak yet, for she understood the value of silence. In silence, people revealed themselves. In a glance too quick, in a denial too forceful, in a tremor of the voice when no tremor ought to be. She observed, catalogued, and quietly stitched the fragments together in her mind. The fete had begun as a celebration of unity, yet here, in its fading hours, it revealed the village's divisions. As Inspector Graves closed his notebook with a snap and ordered that no one was to leave until further notice, Miss Marple reflected on an old truth she knew well. In every village gathering, the garlands may glitter, but beneath them, secrets grow like ivy in the dark. And now, it was time those secrets began to show. Chapter 5. Whispers and Suspicions. The storm of shock that had swept through the fete did not fade with the passing hours. Instead, it settled into a restless hum, like bees disturbed in their hive. People gathered in small knots about the hall, their voices lowered but their eyes sharp, each person leaning in as though afraid the very garlands might be listening. The colonel's death was now the only subject on every tongue, and each rumor seemed to sprout a dozen more. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her accustomed chair, gave the appearance of harmless inattention. Her knitting lay untouched in her lap, her hands folded as though she were simply resting after a long evening. Yet her ears were keen, and in such moments she found listening far more useful than speaking. "I tell you, he argued with Mr. Larkin just yesterday," hissed one neighbor near the punch table. "It was about the hedgerow again. He threatened to have it torn down." "Nonsense," another replied quickly. "It was money that did it. Everyone knows he had his fingers in the club accounts. He was bound to be found out sooner or later." Further across the hall, Mrs. Winthrop spoke in hurried tones to a cluster of ladies. "He was much too attentive to Mrs. Carter, if you ask me. Not all proper. Her husband won't stand for it. Mark my words." The women murmured agreement, their eyes darting furtively to see who might overhear. All these whispers filled the air like 1,000 tiny needles pricking into the truth, but none pierced it fully. Miss Marple knew well that gossip revealed more about the speakers than about the one gossiped of. Still, she listened carefully, weighing each rumor for the kernel of fact that might lie hidden within. At the edge of the room, near the heavy oak doors, stood Clara, the maid. She looked pale, her hands twisting at her shawl, her lips pressed tight as though holding back words that threatened to spill out unbidden. Miss Marple's eyes softened as she watched her. The girl reminded her of so many she had known in her long years. Young women whose voices were seldom trusted, yet who often saw and heard far more than anyone realized. Clara caught Miss Marple's gaze and quickly lowered her eyes, as if ashamed of being noticed. She shifted from foot to foot, then took a small step closer, but stopped short, glancing around nervously. Fear sat heavily on her narrow shoulders. Miss Marple, sensing the struggle within her, rose quietly and made her way to the side of the hall where Clara stood. She moved slowly, not to startle the girl, and when she reached her, she spoke with gentle warmth. It has been a long night, my dear. You look as though you could do with a seat by the fire. Clara shook her head quickly. I can't sit, ma'am. I don't think I could rest even if I tried. Her voice trembled, and she glanced over her shoulder before leaning in a fraction closer. I keep thinking, what if it was what I saw? What if it means I should have said more sooner? Miss Marple tilted her head kindly. Then perhaps you should tell me now. The quietest voices often carry the loudest truths, you know. The maid swallowed hard, her hands clenching. It's just, when I saw that figure with the ribbons, I didn't think much beyond being frightened. But tonight, when the colonel fell, when I saw the garland twisted round him, it felt as if the two things were bound together, as if that ribbon had been waiting for this. Her eyes darted upward, wide and fearful. If someone hid something there, ma'am, then they must know I saw them near it. What if they come for me next? Miss Marple laid a steadying hand on her arm. Do not torment yourself with imaginings, child. Fear grows in the dark, but light will always reveal its shape. If you have seen something important, then it is not a curse but a key. We must treat it so. Clara blinked, her lips trembling as she tried to speak. But before she could continue, the inspector's voice rang across the hall, calling for quiet. The maid shrank back, startled, and Miss Marple allowed the moment to rest, knowing that a frightened heart must sometimes gather courage before its words can emerge. The gossips swirled again around them, each villager clinging to their own suspicions, each rumor painting a new portrait of the colonel's many foes. But Miss Marple's mind remained fixed upon the timid voice at her side, the truth trembling just beyond utterance. For she had learned through long years that the smallest whisper, overlooked by many, often carried the weight of the entire mystery. And she would not let this one slip away unheard. The air in the hall had grown heavy, the cheer of the evening long since smothered by unease. Inspector Graves, after conferring briefly with his constables, turned his attention to Mr. Pritchard, the village solicitor. A neat man with a thin mustache and spectacles that forever slid down his nose, Pritchard had been lingering by the wall with studied composure, as though hoping invisibility might shield him. Mr. Pritchard, the inspector said firmly, "A word, if you please." The solicitor straightened his shoulders and adjusted his tie, stepping forward with a smile that was meant to look confident, but faltered at the corners. "Of course, Inspector. How may I be of service in this? A most dreadful matter." Miss Marple, listening from her chair by the fire, noted the quick glance he cast toward his briefcase, which rested under the refreshment table. His hand twitched ever so slightly, betraying a thought he wished to conceal. Graves wasted no time. "It has come to my attention that the colonel consulted you frequently on matters of property and accounts. I'll ask plainly, did you have any financial dealings with him that might prove relevant tonight?" Pritchard's smile tightened. The colonel was like many men of means, accustomed to engaging his solicitor for routine matters, land transfers, minor disputes, the sort of things that keep villages ticking along. Nothing, I assure you, of importance to his unfortunate collapse this evening. But his tone was too quick, too smooth. Miss Marple watched the faint sheen of perspiration gather at his brow despite the chill that seeped through the hall's stone walls. The inspector pressed on. "There are whispers, Mr. Pritchard, of unsettled debts, that the colonel was not as financially sound as he wished to appear. If such rumors have merit, you would know." Pritchard cleared his throat, tugging at his spectacles. "Rumors are the lifeblood of any village, Inspector, but they rarely hold substance. The colonel was robust in all things, his finances included." At that moment, Clara, lingering nearby, dropped a tray of empty glasses. The sharp clatter startled everyone, and Pritchard stooped swiftly, too swiftly, to snatch up his briefcase. He tucked it under his arm with a firmness that drew every eye in the room. "Sensitive papers," he explained hastily. "Confidential documents. Surely you understand, Inspector." Graves narrowed his gaze. "I'll need to see them. If there's nothing to hide, then there's nothing to fear." The solicitor's lips pressed thin. The sanctity of client confidentiality must be upheld, even in times such as these. Without it, the very fabric of trust unravels. "I cannot, in good conscience, simply hand over private records." It was a clever shield, but Miss Marple knew too well the ways in which men cloak their secrets with noble-sounding words. Her eyes softened as she watched him cling to that briefcase, as though it contained not just papers, but his very lifeline. The villagers murmured among themselves. "He's hiding something. It must be about the Colonel's will." Money, after all, is the root of many a seasonal quarrel. Graves, weary yet unyielding, gave a curt nod. "Very well. But understand this, Pritchard, those documents will be examined, one way or another. You may preserve your dignity by offering them freely, or you may wait until a warrant compels you. The choice is yours." Pritchard inclined his head stiffly, though his knuckles whitened on the handle of the case. He muttered something about the lateness of the hour and withdrew to a corner, his figure taut with unease. Miss Marple observed quietly, her mind turning over the solicitor's behavior. Money, indeed, had toppled greater men than the Colonel, and if secrets lay hidden in that briefcase, they might prove the knot upon which the entire garland of this mystery was bound. Chapter 6. Hidden Motives. Morning light filtered pale and uncertain through the frosted windows of the village hall, casting long bars of silver across the wooden floor. The fate, abandoned in shock the night before, looked forlorn in daylight. Half-eaten mince pies sat untouched. Paper hats lay crushed beneath chairs, and the once proud tree stood askew, its lower branches broken where the Colonel had fallen. The festive air had vanished, leaving behind only silence, disturbed occasionally by the creak of old beams. Miss Marple entered with slow, steady steps, her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders. The constables had been through already, making notes and sketching diagrams, yet she preferred her own way of seeing. She moved not as one searching for evidence with urgency, but as one greeting familiar friends, her eyes falling upon each garland and bauble as though they might whisper their secrets if only treated with patience. She paused by the spot where the Colonel had collapsed. The broken length of garland still lay on the floor, its green needles scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a hidden truth. Kneeling carefully, Miss Marple lifted the rope of evergreen. Her fingers traced its coarse twine, rough from use but strong enough to hold its festive load. It should have been a simple loop, tied hastily by the vicar's wife or one of the young men assisting. Yet as she examined it closely, her sharp eyes caught the difference. A knot, tight and deliberate, lay where no knot ought to have been. Not the careless twist of a villager securing decoration, but the practiced hitch of someone who knew exactly what they were about. Too precise, too purposeful. It was a snare waiting to tighten. Miss Marple's lips pursed ever so slightly. A murderer's hand often betrays itself in the smallest detail, she murmured under her breath, the words half lost to the echo of the empty hall. She lifted the garland higher, testing the strength of the knot. Yes, it could hold weight. Not the weight of the entire decoration, perhaps, but enough to ensnare a sleeve, a scarf, even a man's neck if he were pulled unawares. It was a trap disguised as festivity, cruel intent hidden beneath holly and ribbon. As she rose, she noticed something else. The ribbon that had been tied around the knot was darker in one place, faintly stained, as though someone's hand, sweaty, perhaps, or inked, had pressed it too firmly. A careless trace, overlooked by all but the most patient observer. Behind her, Clara's voice trembled softly. "You see something, don't you, ma'am?" The maid had followed her inside, clutching her shawl close. Miss Marple turned gently, only that what appears cheerful is not always innocent. Decorations are meant to brighten, not to bind. Yet someone, my dear, has turned them to another use. Clara shivered, glancing toward the high windows where the pale light fell. "It makes me afraid, thinking how close we all were, laughing and singing while someone had already laid a trap." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her mind remained keen. Yes, but traps, once seen, lose much of their power. And this one tells us something important, that the act was not sudden impulse but planned. The knot was tied with intent, likely hours before the colonel fell. She laid the garland carefully back upon the table, as though it were evidence in a courtroom rather than tinsel from a fete. Her gaze traveled slowly around the hall, to each wreath, each ribbon, each glittering bauble. They were not merely decorations now, but part of a stage upon which the drama had been played. Every strand of ivy, every loop of rope, every bough of ribbon might bear the touch of the murderer's hand. And in that touch, Miss Marple knew, lay the truth. The village hall was still and watchful, as though holding its breath. Miss Marple lingered near the trestle tables, her gaze not on the crumbs of cake or the overturned cups, but on the memory of a scrap of paper discovered days earlier. She could see it as clearly as if it lay before her now, hidden once in the hollow of a Christmas ornament. Beware the 12th night. At the time, the message had seemed an odd little riddle, perhaps even a prank from some mischievous youth. Villagers had laughed nervously, the vicar's wife had tooted, and the colonel had dismissed it outright with a scoff. Yet now, with the colonel lying cold in the churchyard, those 4 words seemed more sinister than ever. Miss Marple folded her hands before her and allowed her mind to turn the phrase over gently, as one might smooth a creased letter. Beware the 12th night. Not the first, nor the last, but the 12th. Was it meant as a date? The 12th night of Christmas, traditionally a night of endings, of mischief, of turning the world upside down. A night when revelry could mask darker deeds. Or was it more personal? A threat aimed at the colonel, warning him of a danger tied to that date? Miss Marple recalled his dismissive laugh when the note had been read aloud. Superstitious nonsense, he had barked, brushing it aside. But had he truly believed that? Or had he merely pretended not to understand? Her thoughts drifted to the maid's pale face, trembling as she had confided about the strange noises in the churchyard. Whispers, footsteps, movements in the shadows. If the warning had been genuine, then someone had tried to avert disaster. But if it had been a threat tucked inside the ornament with cruel calculation, then the colonel's death was not only deliberate, it was foretold. Miss Marple drew closer to the hearth, where half-burnt logs gave off a faint, acrid smell. She bent slightly, peering into the ash. Had someone destroyed papers here, perhaps even fragments of a matching note? Nothing but gray dust remained, though one charred corner of paper clung stubbornly to the grate. She reached for it with the fire tongs, lifting it gingerly. The scrap was too small to bear words, but the texture was the same thin, creamy stock as the warning slip. Her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. If there had been more than one message, who had received it? And why had only one survived, hidden like a seed inside the fragile glass of a bauble? Behind her, the heavy tread of Inspector Crail echoed across the floorboards. "Still poking about, Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice tinged with weary condescension. She turned politely, merely remembering, Inspector. Sometimes recollection is more useful than rummaging. He grunted, unimpressed, but she went on softly, more to herself than to him. Some warnings are left too late, others too carefully. This one, I think, was not careless at all. Crail frowned. You believe someone wanted the colonel to see it. Her eyes twinkled with that quiet certainty villagers had long since learned to respect. Or at least, someone wanted us all to know that he had been warned. The question, Inspector, is whether we are dealing with a conscience that sought to save him, or a mind clever enough to frame his death as fate foretold. The inspector shifted uncomfortably, but Miss Marple simply folded her hands once more. She knew that in puzzles such as these, timing was everything. The 12th night still lay ahead, and with it, perhaps, the next move of a murderer who had planned too carefully to stop at only one warning. Chapter 7. The Puzzle Assembled. The morning after the fate dawned clear and bitter, the snow hard underfoot, crunching with each step. Villagers gathered reluctantly in the hall once more, not for merriment now, but to answer questions. The laughter and music of the night before seemed impossibly distant. Miss Marple, sitting near the back with her knitting bag, looked less like a participant than a quiet observer. Yet in truth, she was already piecing together the strands of story each villager spun. She began with the vicar's wife, who fluttered nervously when asked where she had been at midnight. "Why, in the kitchen, of course," she said too quickly. "The custard was beginning to set poorly, and I meant to fetch more cream." Her hands twisted the edge of her shawl as she spoke, the words tumbling out as if rehearsed. Miss Marple only nodded kindly, though she noted the faint smell of mulled wine clinging to the woman's breath, strange for one who had supposedly been working near the stove. Next came the pompous colonel's longtime rival, Major Hastings, who had been seen arguing with him earlier in the evening about a disputed boundary hedge. "Rubbish," he barked when pressed. "We quarrel every Christmas. It's tradition by now." I left him in the corner sulking, as always. Yet his bluster carried an edge too sharp, a defensiveness that suggested unease. His story, when repeated, shifted slightly. First he claimed to have been speaking with the solicitor, then with the vicar. Such inconsistencies never escaped Miss Marple's notice. The solicitor himself fared no better under gentle questioning. A trim, precise man, he insisted he had been occupied in the accounts room at the crucial hour, tidying financial ledgers. Yet Miss Marple recalled distinctly that he had joined the carol singing near the hearth, his deep baritone carrying the tune. "Perhaps you stepped away, just briefly?" she asked, her eyes mild but unyielding. He hesitated too long before agreeing, and the flush that spread over his cheeks was answer enough. It was the maid, however, who trembled most when confronted. Her eyes darted to every corner, as though expecting the colonel's ghost to rise from the shadows. I heard something, miss," she whispered, wringing her apron. "Someone pulling at the garlands by the door. I thought it just children, but then the colonel," she broke off near tears. Miss Marple touched her hand lightly, reassuring her. "You have seen more than you think, my dear. Do not be afraid of your memory." What struck Miss Marple was not merely what was said, but how. The vicar's wife repeated herself too often. The major's tone grew sharper each time his alibi was challenged. The solicitor contradicted his own tale within minutes, and the maid, though frightened, remained consistent in her account, as though truth itself lent her steadiness. At last, Miss Marple folded her knitting back into her bag, rising with quiet grace. She had not accused anyone outright, nor raised her voice above a gentle query, but she had planted questions in every mind present, loosening threads knotted too tightly. For in her experience, Every fib left a frayed edge, waiting for patient fingers to tug. And tug she would, until the whole pattern unraveled to reveal the hand behind the crime. The pieces slid into place as Miss Marple sat quietly that evening by her fire, the glow of the coals reflecting in her eyes. Her mind drifted back to the maid's frightened account, the sound of tugging at the garlands, the shadows near the hall doors. At first it had seemed harmless enough, as though children had played a prank. But the colonel's death had proved otherwise. What if, she thought, the garland had not broken by chance at all? What if it had been made to break? She pictured the rope of greenery stretched across the hall, the twine securing it looped in a curious knot she had noticed the day before. Too intricate for a careless hand, too deliberate for mere decoration. A knot fashioned not to hold, but to fail when strain was placed upon it. A staged accident, dressed up in ribbons and holly, hiding a deadly intention in plain sight. The maid, bless her, had seen more than she knew. The pulling sound she described had not been mischief but preparation, the setting of a trap. Someone had been testing the garland's strength, making sure it would collapse at just the right moment. Miss Marple's mind replayed the scene of midnight. The colonel found amid toppled boughs, the rope twisted about his shoulders. It was not the careless fall of an old man. It was a design, cold and careful. She thought, too, of the cryptic note, "Beware the 12th night." At first, it had seemed to speak of some distant danger, a threat yet to come. But perhaps it was not prophecy at all. Perhaps it had been warning enough, an attempt, however feeble, to signal that the stage was already set. The fatal act had been prepared under the cover of gaiety, when everyone's eyes were turned to songs and mulled wine. Her lips pressed together in thought. Who had reason to set such a trap? The colonel was not loved, that much was certain. He had quarreled with neighbors over hedges, with tradesmen over bills, with family over inheritances. His pomp and bluster had earned him many enemies. But only one had stood close enough to the garlands that night. Only one had motive entwined with opportunity. The solicitor's face came to mind, grave and calculating, his earlier contradictions circling back with weight. He had claimed to tend to ledgers, yet joined the singing. He had flushed when asked to explain. And what better way to hide financial misdeeds than to remove the man who might expose them? Money was often the cruelest spur. And yet, Miss Marple did not leap to judgment. She knew too well the danger of certainty. She preferred the patient work of weaving threads until the pattern was undeniable. The knot in the garland, the note in the ornament, the maid's timid whispers, all were fragments, but together they began to form a design clear as frost on a window pane. Leaning back in her chair, she let the fire warm her hands, her expression unreadable. Tomorrow she would ask more questions, gently, as was her way. For the truth had not been hidden in some dark corner or locked drawer. It had been displayed openly, beneath ribbons and holly, for anyone observant enough to see. And now that she had seen it, the murderer's carefully staged accident was beginning to unravel. Chapter 8. The reveal at 12th night. The hall glowed once more with candles and evergreen, though the air tonight carried no merriment. It was 12th night, the end of the season's revels, and yet the villagers gathered not for dancing or song, but for answers. They sat in uneasy clusters, whispering neighbors, solemn-faced clergy, the solicitor with his spectacles glinting, the vicar's wife wringing her hands. At the front, Miss Marple stood with her knitting bag set neatly at her feet, her voice gentle but firm as she began to speak. "My dear friends," she said, "you have all been patient through sorrow and confusion, but the time has come to understand what happened to poor Colonel Fitton. He did not stumble into misfortune. His death was arranged by a hand that believed itself clever enough to hide behind holly and tinsel. Gasps rippled through the crowd, though none truly looked surprised. Miss Marple continued, her eyes moving from face to face. The maid's testimony was most important. She heard the sound of pulling at the garlands earlier that evening. At the time, it seemed a trifle, but when I examined the rope, I found a knot tied not to secure, but to betray. A knot designed to give way under weight. That garland was no decoration. It was a weapon prepared in advance. All eyes turned to the toppled greenery still piled at the far corner, mute evidence of the fate's midnight tragedy. Miss Marple's voice softened. Now, who had reason to arrange such a thing? The colonel, as we know, quarreled with many. But motive alone is not enough. Opportunity narrows the field. Only those close to the hall's preparations could have tampered with the decorations unnoticed. And only one among you stood to gain from the colonel's sudden absence. Her gaze rested briefly on the solicitor, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The colonel's estate, she said quietly, was under scrutiny. There were irregularities in the records, irregularities that would have come to light with time. But with the colonel gone, questions could be delayed or buried altogether. The vicar's wife gave a small cry, half in shock, half in relief. The solicitor pressed his lips thin. "You make a grave accusation, madam," he said stiffly. Miss Marple inclined her head. "Indeed, which is why I did not rely upon suspicion alone. The note in the broken ornament, 'Beware the 12th night,' was not the murderer's work, but a warning from someone who glimpsed the plot. Too late to save the colonel, but enough to reveal the scheme once we listened closely." She turned to the maid, whose eyes were wide with both fear and vindication. "It was you who saw the truth without realizing it, and it was your courage in speaking that gave the first crack in the wall of lies. Never underestimate the value of what seems small." The hall was silent save for the crackle of the hearth. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly. Every garland, every quarrel, every whisper was part of the pattern. When one looks carefully enough, the pattern tells its story plainly. And that story points to a single hand. The villagers leaned in, breath caught, waiting for the name that would change everything. A hush lingered over the hall as Miss Marple let her words settle. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, muffling the world, as though even the night itself leaned in to listen. She lifted her gaze, calm and unflinching, and rested it on the man who had most to lose. "Mr. Pembroke," she said softly, "it was you who tied the knot in the garland. You who ensured that when the colonel passed beneath it, it would fail and cast him down. You staged his death to appear a tragic accident, also that your careful misdeeds might remain hidden." The solicitor's face, pale under the candlelight, tightened into lines of defense. "This is absurd," he muttered. "A trick of the imagination." But the denial lacked force. His hands trembled as he reached for his papers, and the villagers, once hesitant, began to murmur. Miss Marple's voice remained steady, almost tender. "I have known many who believed they could cover their wrongs with cleverness. But cleverness frays at the edges, while truth holds firm. You tampered with the colonel's accounts. He had begun to suspect, had even spoken of reviewing the ledgers after the holiday. You feared exposure, and in your fear, you chose to silence him. The garland was your means, the fate your cover. But fear always leaves a mark, Mr. Pembroke, and yours was written in every contradiction you spoke." The maid, sitting near the back, clasped her apron tightly. She, too, had suspected, though never dared to believe her eyes. The villagers, some shaking their heads, some whispering of betrayal, waited for the solicitor's answer. He gave none. His shoulders sagged, his lips pressed thin, and his silence was as good as confession. The constable stepped forward, laying a hand on his arm, not roughly, but with a quiet inevitability. Mr. Pembroke did not resist. He simply lowered his head, as though relieved the pretense was over. Miss Marple, for her part, did not gloat nor scold. She merely folded her hands together. "It is always a sorrow," she said, "when a man's greed blinds him to what is good and lasting. The colonel was a difficult neighbor, yes, but he deserved better than this. And you, Mr. Pembroke, might have chosen honesty at any time and spared yourself and us all this grief." There was no applause, no cries of outrage, only the solemn quiet of a community coming to terms with the truth. The Christmas garlands, still hanging in tatters at the far end of the hall, seemed a fitting symbol, festivity marred but not destroyed. At last, the vicar spoke a prayer, brief and steadying. Candles flickered, casting gentle halos of light on every face. Though sadness lingered, so too did relief. The uncertainty was over. The whispers could rest. Miss Marple slipped on her coat, preparing to step into the snowy night. Peace, she knew, would return to St. Mary Mead. Secrets had been brought into the open, and with them, the quiet balance of village life could be restored. And with one quiet truth, the season of secrets ended. Reflective, cozy closure with personal invitation. Ask for comment and subscribe. ChatGPT said, "The village hall, once heavy with whispers, soon rang again with gentle carols and the clink of teacups. Children darted between tables, laughter chasing away the shadows that had lingered since that fateful night. Outside, snow fell softly on the rooftops of St. Mary Mead, tucking each cottage beneath a blanket of peace. Miss Marple, seated quietly by the hearth, accepted her cup of tea with a faint smile. She knew well that even amid holly and him, human hearts could harbor envy and fear. Yet she also believed that truth, once spoken gently, had the power to mend what secrecy had strained. The fate carried on, not untouched by sorrow, but strengthened by honesty. Life in the village would continue, as it always did, with neighborly gossip, small quarrels, and quiet acts of kindness. And in that rhythm, there was comfort. For in every mystery solved, another question waits. What would you have done had you found that warning note hidden in the ornament? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, do consider subscribing. There are many more mysteries yet to unfold by the fireside.